pill, orange pill, orange pill.
Yes.
Orange Pill Podcast. You recognize my vocals in that whole thing?
You did it exactly the same.
Orange Pill Podcast. It isn't red. It isn't blue. Orange pill. More and more people are getting orange pilled. I see Paul Tudor Jones has come out. As I predicted, he's going to start talking more and more about Bitcoin. He credited the community with essentially orange pilling him, and he's getting drawn deeper into the rabbit hole. The Michael Saylor buy over there at MicroStrategy obviously caught his eye. He was at 1% of his portfolio. I believe he'll come out soon, and we'll find out that he's closer to 5% or more in his portfolio. So the FOMO, fear of missing out, on the corporate level is kicking in, Stacy.
Yeah, here are some quotes from Paul Tudor Jones, what he said on CNBC. And he obviously, I don't know what his handle is, but he's obviously in the Orange Pill Podcast Telegram group.
Definitely.
Paul Tudor Jones said something incredible on CNBC today. He said, quote, "I've never seen a store of value where you also have such great intellectual capital behind it. When you short the bond market as an inflation hedge, you're really betting on the fallacy of mankind rather than its ingenuity." And then Paul Tudor Jones says other inflation hedges are fundamentally bearish humanity, whereas Bitcoin is bullish humanity. That is an incredible statement that I've never seen expressed so clearly before.
Yeah, it's amazing. These guys like Paul Tudor Jones or Michael Saylor, they got to be incredibly successful because they're incredibly bright and they know how to separate signal from noise, and they know how to manage money, and they know how to make alpha, or they know how to make money consistently over years. And so when you bring the Bitcoin rubric to them, they bring the protocol to them, it goes through their mind, and what comes out are some really fantastic insights. And in a way that the Bitcoin community kind of either intuited or expressed in a different way, these guys are expressing it with a great deal of concision and making it into an action. Remember, it's all about action. When you're managing money, you've got to act. You just can't think. You've got to take an action because you're judged by your actions. That's why as a side note, people are trying. I'll get into that later. Let's talk about Paul Tudor Jones. So Paul Tudor Jones, he said that Bitcoin is both an inflation hedge, but also pro-humanity. And that's very rare. And that's an amazing statement. A lot of people in the Orange Pill community intuitively understood that it's pro-humanity. It's very hopeful. It's very constructive. Later on, we're going to be talking to Michael Krieger, and Michael Krieger said that in the case of PayPal and JP Morgan, they were sucked into the Bitcoin rabbit hole and they had to change their business model, which goes back to something we've been saying a long time, is that you do not change Bitcoin. Bitcoin changes you. And this has been the history. Going back to the New York Agreement in 2016, 2017, they were trying to do a lot of monkeying around with the protocol, but they ended up being changed. This is what drew Michael Saylor in. He saw the block size wars of 2017. He realized that this was anti-fragile. He realized that there was only one Bitcoin and it was running away with it. And it got over $100 billion market cap, and there was nobody going to ever catch up. And all these things are coming together.
Yeah, well, the guy gets paid a lot in order to discern signal from noise, right? So that's his specialty. He could look at a situation and he bets for the long term. He's looking at a community that he sees as he himself is invested in gold, but nevertheless he's betting on Bitcoin as the fastest horse in the race because of the community. And that's the second person. Yeah, Michael Saylor said that. He said it was the community itself that drove him there.
The cyber hornets.
So it's a consciousness. What they're saying is the consciousness of this community is something that is positive. Because frankly, if you look around, you have to agree that the system as we've known it, all of the institutions, whether it's the Fed or the government, the Supreme Court, the Congress, the executive branch, all of that is kind of failing, as are the IMF and World Bank and all these big, huge bodies. They're no longer representing the people. And our consciousness is shifting, just like it did during the Renaissance 1.0, just like it did during the French Enlightenment, just like it did during the Transcendental movement.
Right. And we're heading into hive mind. And a lot of people might not like that term so much because it sounds like we're giving up our individuality and turning ourselves over to the hive mind. But that's not really the case. When you have Bitcoin as the unit of account, which is the hardest money ever known and getting harder every 10 minutes, it just simply means that all redundancies are eliminated and our better nature can be expressed more purely.
I get it. Well, you know what? I have some insight I want to give on what I've noticed this past week, which was a remarkable story in the Jeffrey Toobin masturbating on the Zoom call. And the thing that's really strikes me about it is that he was masturbating while they were cosplaying a civil war. So they were the New Yorker, the peak of the elite, democratic resistance sort of thinking out of Manhattan. That these guys were literally, this guy was masturbating over the idea that there would be a civil war. So they were cosplaying, they were, an election simulation whereby Trump refuses to leave office and Jeffrey Toobin played the courts, the Supreme Courts, and how this decision would go down. Masha Gessen played Trump, and then the likes of Jane Mayer, she was playing, I think, Biden or something. I'm not sure who was playing who, but he chose this moment to start to masturbate. So for me, I want to liken this to the Surrealist movement and Louis Buñuel in particular, because Louis Buñuel, to me, when I saw all these bizarre images of these elite, sophisticated mainstream media, left-wing liberal sorts, cosplaying like a horrible ending for you people out there. And then this guy masturbating over it. It felt to me like a Louis Buñuel film, like nothing, all these images, and it didn't make sense, but then it actually made so much sense. So I want to read because Max and I also lived in the fifth arrondissement of Paris, where all of the surreal movement started with André Breton was the first to write the manifesto, the Surrealist manifesto, right at the Hotel of the Great Men, right? The Hotel Le Grand Dame, right? So that's right underneath the Pantheon, and that's where it was created. He lived in that hotel, and so we used to see the plaques to him all the time. So Louis Buñuel, like when he made his first short film in 1924, and he made it with Salvador Dali, and that's still considered a masterpiece of short film. So they got together and created this film that they wanted to, they hated the avant-garde people, and they wanted to create something that the avant-garde hated, and said the avant-garde loved it. And, they had the eye being cut out and the ants and all that sort of stuff. But what Louis Buñuel thought of surrealism was that the juxtaposition of uncommon imagery and illogical scenes and unexpected juxtapositions. So, when Max and I cover stories, whether for Keiser Report or here, where we juxtapose images in order to tell you a profound story. And so that was what they did with surrealism, was to juxtapose illogical images. And, this movement came out of World War I, and it started in 1917. So, here we have a similar disintegration that was happening in 1917 of the world order. And we're having a similar disintegration now. And if you look at Twitter, if you look at Trump rallies, if you look at Biden walking out to 5 people clapping at his rally, like it's equally surreal, right? None of it makes sense. It's so illogical. And yet, it is perfectly describes where we are today.
Oh yeah, no, I love to talk about surrealism. And before jumping into it, though, I want to kind of return to the Jeffrey Toobin masturbation incident because I think, to me, my takeaway from that incident, and again, we'll be talking to Michael Krieger later in the show, and we talk about transcendentalism, we talk about American literature, we talk about great American writers. And there was a period in American history where there was an American art movement. We're talking about an art movement in Europe. There was an American art movement, and the Americana and expressed as art with men of letters. Post Mark Twain and the beginning of Walt Whitman and the Transcendentalist movement, and one literary outpost for the greatest writers in America. Up until that time, post World War II, with the likes of Norman Mailer and et cetera, Hemingway and these great folks. The institution that was holding a beacon was the New Yorker magazine, the elite
Yes.
of the elite in New York, which was considered the intellectual capital of America, the cultural capital of America. So here we are in 2020, where the New Yorker magazine has been reduced to top writers jerking off on a Zoom call. And I think that pretty well encapsulates where the elite in America are at this moment. They're literally engaging in a circle jerk. And this reflects quite negatively on where the American zeitgeist is at the moment, in my opinion. Now going back to surrealism and Louis Buñuel and this moment captured in time, it was at that post World War I period when the slaughter of World War I caught everyone, made everyone quite horrified. There was also the spiritualist movement in America that was part of the result of World War I, where psychic mediums would travel around the country and make contact with those who had lost loved ones in the war. And there were millions, with the total death count was enormous in World War I. So there's a huge market for that. But I think surrealism grew out of the horror of World War I. And so to tap the unconscious mind, which had been invented only 50 years earlier by Sigmund Freud and his school in Vienna, would be these radical juxtapositions.
Yes.
So to remember the Rorschach test and these other tests that Freud would use to tap into the subconscious and unconscious minds as part of the talking cure, as it was known at that time, the beginning of psychoanalysis and psychology. So in the art that bled over into the artistic field, and so they created these radically images that were juxtapositions that the mind would, the conscious mind would reject on the surface of it, and your unconscious, subconscious mind would be activated. And so this was a moment in art history, and a certain moment in the culture. And so today, what we see, it is surrealist in that we are seeing like New Yorker magazine types whacking off on a Zoom call. That's something that I believe qualifies as surreal in a lot of ways. Our conscious minds are being jarred, but I guess maybe the difference is that it's incidental surrealism versus premeditated surrealism. When Salvador Dali would create a phone shaped in a lobster, that was a conscious effort to change everything your expectations had about a phone and a lobster. But when you see Jeffrey Toobin jerking off on a Zoom call for New Yorker magazine, it is a radical juxtaposition that you're not anticipating, but it's not premeditated. It's just an accidental surrealism, which is I think a different category of surrealism. It's almost it's like when you see these I don't know how to describe it. I'm not going to jump to that conclusion. I'm just going to say it's a slightly different nuance about it.
So, like at the end of, as we went into World War I, and as we were going through World War I, like I said, the order of the world was disintegrating. And first it started with Dadaism, and then that turned into surrealism. So they were trying to make order of the world that was disintegrating they were thinking, they thought we ended up in World War I through too much rationalism and too much logic. So they were trying to make sense by going the opposite way, hitting it with the opposite. I remember Dada, the Dada movement, what they did a lot of that automatic writing, which is kind of like Twitter, because they were trying to not like have any, it was all stream of consciousness, and not like to try to not try to be censored, essentially, not censor your thoughts. Like you were supposed to just write what was coming down. So to me, like when you just brought up the spiritualists, that did happen across America, and Houdini, as you wrote a script about this for Miramax, and that, and I think it was Alec Baldwin, right, was going to star in it. So that what we have today is similar, is that we have these spiritualists, these like charlatans reading the fortunes for, you know, people in distress, right? So you have MSNBC and Rachel Maddow, you have the New Yorker, and they themselves are in distress and trying to comfort their distressed population watching them. So they've become like these hoax spiritualists.
Right. So watching these cable news outlets, it's like attending a seance.
Yes.
Where
yes.
you're sitting around the television or your screen on your laptop, your phone, and you're waiting and you're trying to make contact with the dead, and you hear knockings and you see ghosts and you're frightened and you want to talk to the dead and you want to make contact with the dead. You want to, because your ability to accept the reality has been destroyed. It's too horrific. The ability of your mind to take in all that horror of the American culture today is tapped out. People in America cannot even watch anymore. They turn away, and they have become therefore easy targets for charlatans and fake spiritualists like Rachel Maddow or whomever.
Yeah, and it's part of the problem is that, especially for America, is because we have the empire. We have had the exorbitant privilege. We're the imperial people, and we have the most to lose, we think. So we're the ones holding on hardest. And when you're holding on and not just going with the flow of nature and the cycles of history, you of course become vulnerable, because you don't want to let your, you have no idea why your, 17, 18-year-old son died on the front lines of World War I. It doesn't make any sense. What were they fighting over? And a spiritualist comes to you and tells you, no matter what they see, every single thing, a car horn beeping in the background, a bird chirping, these are all signs of the afterlife. The same thing you see with Rachel Maddow, all signs of Putin are everywhere. And this, Putin always explains all the failures of the neoliberal neocon project.
Right. And also interesting to note that in the art world, it was a break from the trend of representational art, you could say, to this beginning of more abstract art. And a lot of people reject abstract art, but a lot of people don't understand what the mind of what was happening after World War I, and people have become so disassociated and disconnected with what they thought was real. And everything leading up to World War I made sense in a way, like it was reasonable. And then this absolute tragedy unfolded, and when it was over, people would say, well, why did that happen? And nobody could really explain it. Like somebody got assassinated somewhere for some reason, and then this country decided to make a move, and then it just the dominoes tumbled, and then it resulted in this horrific trench warfare. It's considered to be the most disgusting, brutal war, just in terms of hand-to-hand combat. So this is really disgusting. So then from that comes abstraction and Surrealism, Cubism, these things really, right? So in Picasso's Guernica, right? It's his abstract tableau, which is depicting the horrors of war in a way that attacks or addresses the subconscious. You cannot have, compare that to Delacroix, from 100 years earlier, Napoleon on the battlefield, it's a horse, it's a battlefield. He's got a hat, it's like, this says something about war. And okay, well, yeah, maybe, but it's very literal. It's very literal versus subconscious and abstract.
Well, there are reports, if you look at it for Paris, and all these intellectual giants were there in Paris at the time, all the American intellectual giants as well. And World War I hit. And some of these famous writers and artists were actually fighting in the war. And they would go out to the war in the morning and fight, and then come back and be in the salon, at the pub in Paris, and drinking cocktails and, having literary chat. So this is like juxtaposition of insane images that make no logical sense they're going off and fighting a war that they have no idea what it's even about. And here, like, to bring it back to this top, like, here's a guy, Jeffrey Toobin, and all these other people at the New Yorker. They really genuinely feel like they're out in the trenches, that they're in this wild war with these fascists and Nazis. But when you drive around and you go and look at America, like, that doesn't actually exist in real life. But their fantasy is so genuine and so deep and so real. And they're getting off on it. Like, this is...
But there's a certain infantilization as well. So, I mean, we have the archetype of the teenager in their parents' basement playing video games and masturbating, right? Watching porn. So there's Jeffrey Toobin, who's 61 years old, who's supposed to be on the vanguard of literary excellence for the New Yorker magazine, and who's regularly featured on mainstream media. Who's has the emotional maturity of a 14-year-old stuck in their basement watching porn and masturbating. So there's that's a certain infantilization in America that's happened now in the last, that obviously in the period, you could say, where they kind of Reagan kicked it off, where it became very, very simplistic. And then we had incredible deregulation so that anybody could go down to Wall Street and borrow $1 billion as long as you agreed not to obey any laws. You could be a hedge fund manager. And this led to this current state where it's just a sad cultural landscape that it's very sad.
It's disintegrating. Positive stuff is happening, and we're going to cut to our interview with Michael Krieger, because it's all about how awesome and great and smart, sophisticated, as Paul Tudor Jones calls us, the Bitcoin community is. All right, it's Michael Krieger. Max, you originally called him the poet laureate of the debt apocalypse.
Oh, right. So Michael Krieger, one of those rare thinkers and writers that combines brilliant prose with brilliant insight, right? So those two usually don't go together. And that's why he's been such a popular writer on various outlets over the years. And, it's taken him to, I think, a new place in his life as well, out in Colorado. So he's anxious to catch up on things.
Hey, Michael Krieger, welcome to Orange Pill.
Hey, Max. Hey, Stacy. It's an honor to be on your new podcast. Very excited to have this conversation. Thanks for having me. And appreciate that introduction, Max.
Right. So, we have a lot of questions about localism, Bitcoin, and social media and all the censorship going on there. But first, I want to provide that context of, you being the poet laureate of the debt apocalypse. It's kind of upon us right now, this end of the U.S. empire that we see in the IMF this week called for a new Bretton Woods. This seems pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, if there's one thing that I have realized over the past 10 years of public writing, is that, change like this takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. So for example, you two were talking about issues that I wasn't even aware of, before I started writing publicly. And then I sort of learned about the world around me, the reality of how things work, and spent a lot of time learning about it. And so I think there's this tendency, once you sort of discover a lot of the lies of the system, let's say, and want something else, you assume that just because you discovered it, everyone's going to discover it right away, because it's so obvious now. But the truth of the matter is it's a process, and there are waves of people. There's waves of, let's say, discovery. There's waves of consciousness evolution for humans. There's all sorts of stuff like this where it takes time. And I realized that just because you discover a truth doesn't mean that your neighbor's going to discover the truth. Certainly not on the time frame that you might want it to happen. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting that I feel lucky. When I first moved to Colorado 10 years ago, it's going to be 10 years this December, I figured, things would be happening way quicker than they were. But, I caught a lucky break, because these last 10 years have allowed me to establish roots and learn a lot of skills and be very comfortable where I'm at, as opposed to what you see now, which is a lot of people panicking to get out of New York City. There's sort of, bidding up houses. And so, I was lucky in that sense. So, I like to say, I sort of see things too far ahead of time. And I think you guys are probably in the same boat. And that can be a blessing and a curse. It can be a curse sometimes because you expect things to happen quicker, but ultimately I think it's a blessing because it gives you space to prepare. But yeah, I think a lot of the trends that we, the three of us have been discussing and forecasting for years are now coming to a head and becoming undeniable.
Right. So let's focus on this move that you made out of the city into Colorado, and you were ahead of the curve, as you point out. And now we've got a situation where, because of COVID, there's been a reveal that the economy is very fragile, more fragile than people had anticipated. The central banks are printing like crazy to try to paper it all over. And you've got social cohesion risk, as they call it over there at The Economist magazine. You've got a lot of outbreaks of violence around the country. So is this, how do you position that? Some people call it the fourth turning. That's part of a guy who wrote a book called The Fourth Turning. Is it, or I know historically you look at markets going back hundreds of years, because there's many cycles in play here. So on the Michael Krieger kind of historical timeline, where are we? Are we pre-revolutionary? Is it the fourth turning? Is it the Kindrikoff cycle, which is a 60-year cycle? Where are we?
Right. So that's a great question. I think all of the above would be my answer. When I was younger, learning history for the first time, American history, even some world history as well, as they intertwine, I noticed early on, when I was very little, that, wait a minute, there seems to be like a certain amount of years that pass between revolution, Civil War, World War II. I found that interesting, and it sort of demonstrated that there are cycles to the human condition that a lot of people like to ignore. But then Howe and Strauss in The Fourth Turning put that into like a book, sort of the Bible of the cycle, called The Fourth Turning. And as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, well, yeah, this makes perfect sense. I'd thought about it before, but they really put a lot more meat on the bones to it. So I jumped to that right away. But the longer I go, the more I see bigger cycles even. There could be, that could be just like there's smaller cycles in, let's say, the stock market or Bitcoin. There's clearly cycles we see around the halvening. There are cycles to other things that are even bigger than this, that are even bigger than the fourth turning cycle, which is around an 80-year generational cycle. I mean, there are probably 250-year cycles, 500-year cycles, 1,000-year cycles. And so what cycle are we in? I tend to think, without being able to prove any of this, that we're at a moment where a lot of cycles are coming together. And I think the generational cycle, or the fourth turning cycle, that Howe and Strauss discuss in brilliant detail, is actually a small cycle potentially in what we're looking at. And when you think about stuff like Bitcoin and the internet and all these things that have happened post World War II, it makes me feel like this is bigger than just those typical 80-year cycles. I mean, we really are potentially launching into a new era for humanity that is actually probably inconceivable to most at this point, including myself. But I feel it. I feel that optimism beyond, let's say, 5 or 10 years.
Actually, Michael, you were the first to ever tell us about the fourth turning. I remember on Keiser Report a few years ago, and you were the first to kind of popularize it in this whole, orange pilled space. So how does that whole unfold? But also, what sort of signs do you see in particular this election cycle and the social media and the censorship happening? Like, it seems chaotic and crazy, but is there a way to make sense of it that makes it all seem obvious?
Okay, so again, this is my opinion, and it's an optimistic one, right? I mean, ultimately, it's an optimistic one, and the way I see it is, so we were talking about cycles before. Is human consciousness, right? First of all, is that real? Like, can you evolve consciousness? I believe you can. I mean, we talked about spiral dynamics on your show, a couple years ago. And if human consciousness can evolve, and it can evolve amongst masses of people, how does that change things, right? To me, that's a fundamental change that we can't even, contemplate easily. It's so dramatic. That would be the most dramatic change if we can do that over the next few years. That's possible. Now, of course, right? When it comes to something like that, like someone's consciousness level starting to resonate at a higher level, it's almost always the result of some sort of pain, some sort of difficulty, some sort of realization that you didn't want to face previously. And so I think that's what the next 5 years are about, or maybe more, but at least probably around that amount of years, where people that have wanted to deny what's going on, how we've been tricked, how we're manipulated, how we're socially engineered, all of these things sort of have to face that reality. And you can respond to that in a new number of different ways, right? You can just develop Trump derangement syndrome, or you could be, all alt-right and angry or whatever. I mean, you hateful rights, punch down, punch sideways instead of punching up, stuff like that. But I hold out hope, right? Because we do still have reasonably free communications amongst each other globally. Again, never has happened in the history of mankind. As much as the tech giants are trying to stop it, this is just there's no point of reference to human beings, the 7 billion of us being able to talk to each other online in real time. It's just, we can't even contemplate what that's going to lead to. And so, Bitcoin is another example. Again, something that's never been possible before, that's possible now and thriving and growing. So to me, as more people get on that train, as more people sort of awaken, you're going to have people devolving, right? We see that now, on all sides of the political spectrum. I tweeted yesterday, we aren't even, mainstream political people aren't even debating ideas anymore. They're just calling each other foreign agents. But right. And as depressing as that can be, they get a lot of, let's say, play on social media. I do feel like there's this growing, grassroots minority, very small minority, but it's growing fast, of people that are saying, that's not for me. That's not how I'm going to respond to this. As bad as things are, I'm not going to lower myself, right, to acting like a complete lunatic and fool. As Ben Hunt, wrote in one of his pieces, he explained it, turning into a rhinoceros, right? I mean, this is what happens in times like this. People turn into rhinoceroses and they just start trampling everything and making a mess. But don't do that, right? Let's not do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you bring up a good point, is that the mainstream media, the fourth estate is supposed to, help the people not only hold power to account, but also try to explain what's happening in the economy, in the politics, geopolitics around them. And so, like, when I started the top of the show, our interview here is like the fact that the IMF is calling for new Bretton Woods. This will be so much more profound impact on the United States than whether Biden or Trump win, actually. And yet it wasn't mentioned at all. Nobody in the US media mentioned it. We did. And of course, that will just be dismissed as, propaganda for mentioning this, that the IMF itself gave a press conference saying this. So, I mean, if we lose our exorbitant privilege while we're fighting over, is Hunter Biden more corrupt than Eric Trump? What do you have to say about this?
Well, exactly right. And I didn't mention this, but I shut down my website in July, and I was thinking already about moving on to something different. But when I saw the environment, the political environment, when Sanders was sabotaged again, it just became very clear that the normal channels of changing things are just not functioning and aren't going to function, right, until we sort of hit a brick wall. So I felt like I had said everything that I needed to say on a lot of these topics, at least in blog form. I mean, I still tweet about it. And then I needed to refocus on, how do I respond personally? What can I do? What's interesting out there, as you say, what can we cheer on? What can we promote? Because there's a lot, actually. It just doesn't get the airtime. And so what I hope and what I think is that as things get worse, right, as things deteriorate further, what's interesting about this election is, my opinion, no matter who wins, right, you're gonna continue to see decay. You're gonna continue to see oligarchs steal everything. You're gonna continue to see the national security state clamp down on any sort of dissent, whether it's right or left or middle. You're going to see more restrictions on speech on these tech giant platforms. You're going to see more of that, right? You're going to see that it doesn't matter. And so my hope and belief is that as it becomes undeniable, increasingly undeniable, and as people lose faith in the traditional system that we're told, right? This is what you see everywhere from everything. Vote, you got to vote. That's all you hear, right? I mean, it's the laziest form of political activism there is to vote. I think that an a large number of people are going to gravitate towards truly revolutionary things. And as I tweeted a couple of days ago, the only two political movements that have some sort of gravitas right now that I find interesting are actually Bitcoin and localism. They're different, but they're similar in some ways as well. So that's, I think more people are going to gravitate towards actual action, right? Direct action, as opposed to something so lazy as voting.
Right. Yeah. So to pick up on these themes here, I got a quote from Paul Tudor Jones, which I will tell the exact quote in a second. But basically, what he's saying here, and he's interviewed on a big mainstream media outlet this week, he was saying that he is getting into the camp of pro-inflation. So he's buying gold. He's essentially shorting bonds. And he's looking at Bitcoin. He's got a Bitcoin position. And then he went on to say that it's very rare to see something like Bitcoin because when you're shorting bonds, it's a bet against humanity. But when you're buying Bitcoin, it's a bet pro-humanity. And he said he's hardly ever seen that or never seen that before. The exact quote goes, quote, "I've never seen a store of value where you also have such great intellectual capital behind it. When you short the bond market as an inflation hedge, you're really betting on the fallacy of mankind rather than its ingenuity, like you are with Bitcoin." Your thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the most it's interesting, right? And it demonstrates his intelligence that he's able to pick up on that, which of course I agree with. One of the common threads that I've noticed amongst people in Bitcoin, whenever I mention it, a lot of people say, "Oh, me too." The same thing happened to me. Is that pre me discovering Bitcoin and getting into it, learning about it in mid 2012, I was in a sort of a dark hole, right? In the sense that I felt that if the trends that I saw coming were going to end up in the place that I believed they would, I would own some gold, I would own some silver, I would be prepared, relatively speaking. But it was a gloomy outlook, right? I mean, it was hard to come to a conclusion that, okay, well, everything's going to collapse and you're going to have your gold and silver and be okay, but what's left? What's going on around us? It's sort of like a negative reset. And so once I learned about Bitcoin, I immediately grasped the idea that, oh, this is a positive reset potential. And before that, I could not see an outcome. Let's say economically, financially, for the financial system, that was a positive one. But once Bitcoin came around and I learned about it and I understood it, I saw the positive reset potential. And that was it. I mean, ever since that point, I've had an overall optimistic viewpoint on the future of humanity. And as I mentioned the last time we talked, I think there's more to come. And I think we don't even know about it, but I have this feeling all sorts of stuff is going on as we speak under the surface level, not Bitcoin related, not even financial system related, that could change the world in ways we can't imagine. And, one thing I tweeted about is this idea of energy. And if you could, because right now when you put solar panels on, generally speaking, you're tying into the grid. You're not really off grid at all. You're not producing your own electricity and then storing it to use. But that really fundamentally for me would be a huge change. If people could actually produce energy on site for themselves at a reasonably low cost, where most people could do it and not have to be tied into a grid. And I sort of feel like hopefully we're getting to that point. But just think about what that would allow. It would really allow you to live more remotely. It would open up a lot of potential for people. To be, again, this is just more decentralization, localism ideas. We need, interestingly enough, right? Localism, when you hear localism, you think, oh, you're just retreating into like these tribes. But actually, for localism to thrive in the way that I want it to, you need technology to allow you to live more locally or more remote and more connected, because people want to be connected. You don't want to just sit in a log cabin in the middle of nowhere off grid and just wait for something bad to happen. That's not fun.
Well, I mean, we talk to Abe Cambridge all the time. He posts a video in Orange Pill episodes, almost every episode. And we talk about the Solarpunk is what it's called. It's like cypherpunk, cyberpunk, solarpunk. And this is the sort of decentralized future where you're more self-reliant and anti-fragile. So, when we're talking about this positive Bitcoin future versus the whole negative future imagined by the bond and gold investors. I mean, that's all we've had since the last Bretton Woods. And then in 1971, when we went off the gold standard. I just find it interesting that if you look at the leadership in our country, whether it's Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or all of these guys, they've been around since like 1971. They've been in power since we handed them ultimate power of fiat currency. And now they're at the end game of that. And you see what they're doing. Their instinct is censorship, shutting down, not letting you hear news at all. Like the story about the New York Post is just remarkable, right? That shows a deep contempt for the ordinary American, that they can't handle the truth, that they can't handle this sort of information. And, on the other side, we have this Bitcoin community, which is like anywhere you go, at any conference, anywhere in the world, you meet people from dozens and dozens and dozens of different countries, and we're all united in this self-sufficiency, in self-reliance, in anti-fragility, and in like a sort of Bitcoin nationality. Like this is our sense of being. You just need one Satoshi, and nobody knows who owns 10 Satoshis or 10,000 Satoshis. 10,000 Bitcoin. So how do you see this playing out? Like Paul Tudor Jones saying that this is the positive step. Do you see just more people looking like, instead of voting, like you have the choice, Biden or Trump, it's the most important election in your lifetime? Or is the election just exit that system and go long Bitcoin?
Okay, right. So this is something I've written about quite a bit. And I think, again, I like to say Bitcoin is a teacher as well, because so many of the attributes that are inherent in the protocol are what I believe form a framework for applying to other things. That doesn't mean with a currency right here in the same way, but just philosophically. And one of those things is voluntarism, right? Bitcoin came around, it was nothing. Some people started mining it, some people started promoting it, people started learning about it. And now here we are 10 years later, where people like, Jamie Dimon and his bank, JP Morgan and PayPal, right, who were huge skeptics originally, are now forced to change. And how were they forced to change? It wasn't through legislation. It wasn't through anything other than Bitcoin just working for 10 years, right? I mean, that's all it's done. It's just continued to create blocks and exist and function. And it changes, it changed the biggest bank in America. It's changed PayPal. It's incredible what that's done. All voluntary. Right? It's all just people deciding, this is interesting. This is something I want to be on board with. This is revolutionary. And so I think a lot about governance and citizenship and nationality in that sense. And the unfortunate thing is people are just born into a piece of dirt, and they're pretty much 99% of us are going to live on that piece of dirt forever under rules that they never agreed to. Okay. Now, I like the Constitution of the United States, even though we don't follow it. I happen to think the Bill of Rights was brilliant and worked for so long. Republican form of government plus democracy, all that stuff. I like it, right? I happen to like it. We don't follow it anymore, but I like it, the concept. But what if you don't like what you're born into? You're sort of just stuck. Okay. And so is that ethical? Why are we living like this? Does it make sense? And so what I want to do is I want people to think about that more. And this is, I started writing about this with the Catalonia thing, and the idea that, Spain says you can't leave, right? You're locked in forever. So if you say that to a province, it's not a voluntary association at all. It's some sort of bondage. And it gives you, the only out there is some sort of revolution. I mean, you have no other choice. So, I really think that if we can get into people's heads the idea that it is unethical to bind people to rules or documents that they fundamentally don't agree with or never agreed to at all, we can start to think about that in a different way. How do you do this? And one of the things I said, actually, of all the only flaw I think in the Constitution, it allows for secession. But what I would have done is I would have said every 25 years or so, I mean, we can debate the amount of the time span, but every 25 years or so, the state automatically has a vote on whether they want to remain in the union. Okay, so it's like this regular thing where you're constantly, affirming, I want to be part of this union. It still works for me. And, ironically, I actually think that would reduce the odds of secession or splintering because there's leverage. Okay, right now you don't have any leverage. The person has no leverage. The state, even the state body, has little leverage. Okay, they're really under the thumb of the national government. You see in Catalonia again. You see it here even. So if let's say these apparatchiks in D.C. understood that every state was going to have some sort of a vote every 25 years, they would be more hesitant to do some of the things they're doing, because there's always that out. There's that automatic process to, and again, I don't think it should be like a 51% to 49% thing. I mean, we can debate that. Should it be 60? Should it be 65? The threshold should probably be high to break away from a union. But I think we need more voluntary unions if we're going to have nation states, okay, which who knows, right, where we're going. But let's assume we live in a world of nation states still in the next 100 years. They need to be more voluntary. They need to be more fluid. We need to have more say in the types of governments we live under. Just like Bitcoin allows us to have a say in the sort of monetary savings that we engage in. So that's sort of how I see things. It's beyond Bitcoin. Bitcoin is phenomenal, but it's much. This can be much bigger than just that.
Right. So to follow up on a couple of things there. Well, first of all, in the United States, you do have a state, Wyoming, that is almost seceding from everybody else using Bitcoin. And they're setting up their own legislation and their own governance based more on Bitcoin. So that's kind of interesting. But when you say we are now able to live more remotely, another way to phrase that is we are now able to live closer to nature. And that's something that you write about and tweet about often. We've seen your photos of various vegetables and other flora and fauna from your garden, and you're taking a lot from that. You're closer to nature, and you're writing about how this has made you. I guess it's fed your soul in a way that couldn't be otherwise fed. And another thing you were mentioning about, you said we ignore the cycles. There are cycles, but we ignore the cycles. So to tie this all together, I mean, there have been civilizations that were understanding of what the penalty is to ignore cycles. And I'm thinking about the Greek theater and the idea of tragedy, right? The tragedy in the Greek theater is people ignore cycles. They ignore what's blindingly obvious. They choose to ignore, and they walk into a tragedy. So this has been dealt with already 2,500, 2,600 years ago. And finally, my round off my point here, if you're in nature and you are now in sync with these cycles and you're not fighting them tragically, do we get into this concept of a hive mind? Because, in nature, there are many hive minds. Trees, we now know, are constantly communicating with each other in many ways through the subterranean root system and through other ways. The symbiotic relationship between bees and pollen, between all these things going on. These are all hive minds. Bees are not out there waking up at 9 a.m., grabbing a cup of coffee and going out to get some nectar. They're working on some underlying fundamental instinct. So are we, by cutting ourselves off from the nation state and by adopting Bitcoin, are we now going to subsume into a more natural state of a hive mind, which is a more natural expression of who we are, Michael Krieger?
Right. So, yeah, and I think, again, this goes back to the global consciousness idea. Are we becoming more conscious as a people? I mean, Terence McKenna had this idea of the global brain. He talked about that. I mean, his thoughts on the internet, it's fascinating. I mean, he died in the 90s, but, the internet was coming up. And his descriptions of the internet, in the very nascent stages was just so on point about what it really meant. And I still believe that, even with this big tech censorship. I don't think this is gonna, last forever. I think the global brain wants to form. Humanity wants to evolve its consciousness. We want to go to the next level. I really think that's the case, and we have the technology that allows us to do it. Because if we're not connecting globally, it's hard to create that, right? I mean, you're not talking to other people across the world, and so Bitcoin has already created that global beehive, in that way. But we can do it in other things too. There's no reason. Well, we don't need elites lording over us and telling us what we can do, and we can sort things out. Bitcoin. People would have bet against it because they thought, no, you can't sort this out. You need a central authority. You need someone to make the rules. But you don't. Turns out you don't, right? And look at JP again, like I said, JP Morgan and PayPal are being bent to the will of Bitcoin, not the other way around, which is what a lot of people expected. And so you might things may turn out more positively than people think over time. Again, next 5 years, dicey, but beyond that. And so the nature thing is important. And you know, my new website, when I do launch it, it probably will be next year at some point. I mean, I have to feel like it's time and I'm ready to do it. But yeah, some of the topics are going to be about nature. And, you know, I have this one post already that I'm going to write, which is why, you know, about like why everyone should have a garden. And one of the reasons is, as you mentioned, it puts you in very close sync with cycles and things outside of your control. So I think humans like to think one of two ways, binary. Okay, there's nothing I can do, right? These are my circumstances. It's terrible. I'm screwed, right? And then there's the other people who think that I am all powerful. My will, I will bend the world to my will. I can do whatever I want, and outside circumstances don't matter. The truth is, it's a mix of both. And gardening, more than anything else that I've really experienced, throws that in your face every single day, because it is so important that you know what you're doing, that you prepare, that you work really, really hard at it, and you learn over time. But it's equally important that, you know, some crazy weather event's going to come and kick your butt. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about that. So there's this sort of balance between what you put into it and then the external circumstances. But the key lesson, right, from gardening is not, you know, I made a mistake, my biggest mistake ever, actually, in the last 3 weeks. I left some of my warm weather plants out when I saw the forecast would be 30 degrees. I had hundreds of tomatoes, 25 peppers, months of work wiped out, just completely wiped out. It was my mistake. It was also weather, but it was my error, because in September, I was able to survive a freeze perfectly fine. And so I got overconfident. And so my garden got wiped out. I mean, the summer stuff got wiped out. It was very depressing. But guess what? I'll never forget that. You know, I'll never forget that. And so it goes to show that it was the best garden I've ever had. But because I wasn't quite thinking, and the weather just hit me out of nowhere, it got wiped out. So again, this is what I think people need to understand. You know, there's cycles, but at the end of the day, you got to do the best you can. You know, definitely try.
Right. I want to follow up on this tomato wipeout story, actually. I think there's some interesting things to dig in here. Because you and I both share a Wall Street background, and that's kind of how we bonded initially, is that we were critical of a lot that goes on in Wall Street. And, you know, you were writing great exposés about this. But, you know, on Wall Street, and you were an analyst on Wall Street, if you miss an estimate for the quarter and the stock drops 10, 15% one day, you get, quote, wiped out. And within 5 minutes, you've completely forgotten about it. Versus, okay, you've got a crop of tomatoes. You misanalyze the weather. You got your food stores wiped out, and it hurts. It hurts you deeply. You know, there's a big difference here. So there's a whole generation now that's been brought up on Wall Street, that's been brought up on financialization, that's been brought up on stock markets, that's has swapped human values for financial values. And that is the dominant valuation. You know, Donald Trump, he'll say, vote for me because the stock market's at all-time highs, right? That's probably the first time a president led with that as his rallying cry. It's not a chicken in every pot, although it is a variation on the chicken in every pot, but obviously chickens are a lot closer to the farm than the S&P 500 and your 401k, right? So I guess my question is, do you see that where the values that you were learning on Wall Street ultimately did not prove worthwhile to feed your soul, and were not life lessons that really meant anything, Michael?
Yeah. So one of the things I realized, growing up in Manhattan, I did have some exposure outside of that, of course, but, you know, growing up there, I never questioned, you know, what that lifestyle really meant and how it compared to, let's say, the lifestyle I have now. But after I moved here, I really became in clear focus. You know, in Manhattan especially, right, a very dense city with tall buildings, you're essentially disconnected from nature all the time. You know, you maybe see a star here and there, the moon here and there, the sunset here and there, but you're very disconnected from the natural cycle of things and just the beauty inherent in it, right? I mean, and that disconnection is really sort of a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. I mean, with light pollution and all that stuff, our ancestors were very connected for every single period in humanity prior to, let's say, electricity and the megalopolis. Were connected to nature and the cycles of nature constantly. Now, that didn't stop them from messing things up, but I do think it hurts the soul. And the more time I've spent in nature since I've been in Colorado, the more I realize I love it, and the more I realize it just makes me inherently happier. It provides this peace to me that allows me to just be a little bit less, I don't know, like sociopathic, let's say, because if you think about it, right, the lifestyle in Manhattan, and I lived it, okay, and I know how pernicious it is. It's because you're disconnected from nature, what it becomes a human on human game. So every single day, it's just like you wake up and you're competing against other humans and you're trying to get more of, in the case of New York, mostly people are chasing money, trying to get more of that and competing in various roles to get more of that or to increase your social stature, right? So you can go to the better restaurants, you can get, let into the better clubs, whatever it is. It's just this human on human competition. And there's nothing wrong with human on human competition that's healthy, but I think we've taken it to such an extreme. Well, I know we've taken it to such an extreme now where the idea of cooperation, voluntary cooperation, is like crazy to most people. They don't even think about it because they're just so in their own head of, I got to get mine, and it doesn't matter what sort of impact I have on anyone else around me or society at large. I'm just going to go get it. And, I think if people spent more time in nature, to be quite frank, I think you'd lose that drive. I don't think you'd have it. I think it calms you down. I think it puts things in perspective. I think it just makes you actually a better and happier person. That's what I've found, at least. But to your point about like tomatoes versus Wall Street analysts, it's interesting because what actually did attract me to Wall Street in the beginning was that it felt like actually every day, if you're a trader and you're an investor, every day you're being sort of judged, right? Are you right? Are you wrong? Do you lose money if you're wrong? You make money if you're right. And what made me so disgusted, amongst other things, about the bailouts in 28, 29, which made me leave Wall Street, is that I realized that was fake. It wasn't true. When Wall Street loses, they win. It doesn't matter. They get bailed out. You can't lose. So all of these, like Bill Ackman, people like that are just these nasty Wall Street people who, just go on CNBC and cry when they lose some money, and then of course get bailed out by the sugar daddy Fed. It just exposed that whole thing to me as like a fake game that I couldn't get any satisfaction out of anymore. Because I had believed, that it really was this giant global poker game where you were playing against people based on, your ability to analyze stuff. But it turns out the only thing you need to analyze is the Fed. So it just lost all interest to me. And, that's why I'm here now. And, and the garden is a real test, though. There's no central bank to bail your tomatoes out.
That's very well put. But as you were talking, I was thinking of transcendentalism, which is an American philosophy that formed in the mid 1800s, and Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course Henry David Thoreau. You sound like you're a modern on Walden Pond out there, but I mean, I think that kind of fits in with this whole Bitcoin movement that has erupted, which is a neo-transcendentalism of self-reliance, of the belief in the goodness of man and nature, and that the simplicity of it. I mean, there's this whole meme going around that, you don't need chairs. Chairs are luxuries because like you could buy a few Satoshis for the chair instead. Like why buy a chair? And that's very neo-transcendentalism. I kind of feel like do you look at old philosophies like the transcendentalists or like the Enlightenment thinkers or like the Renaissance art? Like are these something that inform you today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't read Emerson in a while, but I do remember when I did, he was just my favorite. I remember thinking like, oh, I'm really connecting this group. And this is when I was, a New York City guy, totally not exposed to nature really at all. But I always connected with, Emerson and Thoreau, but even in particular, Emerson. So I completely understand what you're saying. They don't inform me, let's say now, because I'm not reading them now. I probably should read them again. But yeah, I mean, I always naturally connected with that sort of outlook and philosophy. And I do think we can have a new Renaissance. right? But I mean, the key message to me is like, the thing that we're being told to do is vote is the last thing that's going to lead to a new renaissance. If we're going to have a new renaissance, it's going to be a couple. It's going to, first of all, at the base level, it's going to take as many people as possible creating a renaissance in their own mind, right? In their own actions and their own individual circumstances. And then if enough people do that, of course, some of those people are going to happen to be really talented like Satoshi, right? Extraordinarily gifted people. And so if they can combine the consciousness plus that natural gift, think about what it can serve the world, right? I mean, we're going to, so it's important, right? A lot of people will say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, it does matter because, even though you might not be Satoshi, you could be Satoshi in your own little world. And so if enough people do that, we can get there. And so I actually do also, I'm very encouraged by, I knew it was time to stop my website when I stopped listening to like the kinds of interviews that I had been listening to. And I noticed, wait a minute, I'm just listening to homesteading videos. That's all I was listening to. It was like 24/7. I was just like, listening to all these people like homesteading in Idaho or Alaska, because I wanted to hear about these skills that were connecting to the sort of lifestyle that I'm trying to move more towards in my own life. And, I knew something was happening with me. A change was happening, a bigger change than I already had. And so I think, though, this isn't just me, though. I think we're in the early stages of a back to nature trend. And so you mentioned transcendentalism and this idea. I mean, I think we're heading, towards a sort of era of that, over the next few years. And I think that's a good thing. And I think, a lot of people say, okay, people moved out because of COVID. People are leaving big cities because of COVID. New York, San Francisco, the obvious examples. Clearly true, okay? But is there something else going on there? Is there a certain amount of people that already had the inclination that, I sort of had one foot out the door in New York or one foot out the door San Francisco already. And then this was just the final straw. And I'm out of here. I sort of feel like that's happening too. And so we're on the precipice of a back to land, back to nature, not in a I'm doing this because I'm afraid of the apocalypse sort of way, but I'm doing this because I want to feed my soul kind of way. And I encourage it. I've been encouraging it for years. If you live in a big city, if any of what I'm saying is connected to you, get out, just get out, do something else. Smaller cities are amazing. Okay, I live in a smaller city, happen to live in a really, a particularly really interesting one, but there's so many. I mean, I love small cities, I love small towns. Okay. And then hopefully we get more technology that allows living in those small towns, plus connectivity and energy, self-reliance, stuff like that, makes it all easier. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of that.
All right. Well, that's a great point to end on a very positive note, except for, if you go raise your tomatoes, remember the Fed can't bail out your tomato catastrophes.
Right. Well, Tomato Gate. It's the biggest scandal happening in Colorado right now. The entire crop was wiped out. Who is responsible? We need to dig deeper into this.
We might need a GoFundMe in the Bitcoin community.
Yeah.
Just
send me tomatoes.
Yeah. Send more tomatoes.
I have no sauce.
Right. So great talk with Michael Krieger, right?
Fascinating, really. I've been friends for a long time, and sharing, him sharing really his life and what's going on there is really nice, really great.
Right. So you remember he said that, the only choice these New Yorker sorts want to, I don't know why I had that accent, New Yorker sorts.
Yeah, it sounds like Travis Bickle.
Well, the only choice they want you to have is between a man with dementia and an orange clown car. So, these are the sort of futures they have outlined for you. But I want to show you that, when we build these communities of self-reliance and fearlessness in terms of confronting these illogical, surreal events and being positive about the future that we can build, because we do have a lot of power. We do have thousands of years of human history where we survive all sorts of stuff. And we, as humans, invent amazing art, masterpieces, and amazing philosophies and works of literature. And we could we could still do this. We're able to do this if we can step away from these disintegrating, failing institutions, right? Because I found this one sad and remarkable, and glad, however, that therefore but the grace of God go I. Following the debates, Democratic support for a fracking ban dropped an eye-popping 16 points from 65% to 49%. So there is your brain on partisanship. 65% before those debates, especially the vice presidential debate where Kamala Harris was like, we're totally for fracking. We're not going to ban it. I promise you we're not going to ban it. So before that debate, 65% of Democrats were for a ban on fracking, which, just watch the dozens of Keiser reports about this. There's lots of environmental disaster, the financial cost of massive cleanup costs after these companies go bankrupt and abandon the wells, the fact that none of it makes money, whatever, 65% were against it. Now it dropped to 49% after that just one debate because it became a partisan issue, and your fragile identity where principles no longer matter. It's just like hoping that you can belong to some group, no matter how damaging it is to you and your society around you.
Right. When you have a group of people like these folks who change their opinion on fracking that demonstrate no integrity and no conviction, they are ripe to be influenced by ideologues, right? If you have no individual integrity and no conviction about any of your beliefs at all, and you're simply going to be pulled by the nose in any which way because you want to be part of the fan club of somebody in that instant, then along comes an ideologue, and now you're in serious trouble. And I think that that's what I've seen on that left in America more and more, is that they are begging for an authoritarian dictator to come along and tell them how to think 24/7, because they have stopped thinking. They've shown complete lack of integrity and a complete lack of conviction, and that is quite sad. Again, sad.
When we talked to Ala Kanani, when we talked to Nozomi Hayes about how Bitcoin harnesses all those things like fear and greed those have been the worst moments in human history. Like we've talked about the positive moments of the Renaissance, the French Enlightenment, all these great movements of great art, great thinkers, great civilizations created. But also we've had great civilizations destroyed. We've had really negative things. And it's driven by fear and greed and things like that, which were harnessed by the wrong people or the wrong ideologies. So when you have the likes of the New Yorker masturbating over you being in a civil war with your family and your neighbors, that's like something that should make you stop and think. Like, or if you're on Twitter and I see this, like whatever Hunter Biden did and all these emails, I haven't really gone into it because I'm in a next phase, right? I'm in orange pill land. I don't really dwell in this disintegrating empire system over here. But what you see is that, they revealed some sort of corruption going on with China. And what you see in the comments are the partisans who are like, so who cares? Nobody cares about this. It's too late. What about now? Do the Trumps now? And so you see these people who are the victims of these charlatans like the Rachel Maddows and the New Yorker. Those are the spiritualists of the World War I era who went around and plundered people with their Ouija boards and their seances and pretended that they were communicating with some special higher power, that they understand these, right today, it's the deep state. We have deep state sources, and the CIA would never lie to you, and they would never lie to us. And here's their information about what's happening.
All right. When these folks give away their integrity and give away their conviction, and they open themselves to authoritarian dictators and media propagandists like on MSNBC and these other networks, when they are confronted with the brutal facts of a story that should be an important one in the political history of America, they turn into spiritualists guided at the seance table, trying to listen to mysterious knocking at the door to confirm their bias. So confirmation bias is how spiritualism works. People go into the seance believing they're going to talk to their dead relative, and the spiritualist merely nudges them to confirm their bias, that the knocking at you here on the roof there, that's your dead relative. But they're already preloaded. So here these folks are preloaded to believe ideologically that Trump is an alien, that Trump is not actually as Americana as apple pie, hot dogs, and baseball, and P.T. Barnum. He is an American archetype, as Mark Twain is an American archetype, and George Washington is an American archetype. But people in that New Yorker, masturbating crowd, the circle jerks around the Algonquin circle jerk table, do not want to accept that Trump is America. They think that they identify with Obama. Obama would be doing great as a European, as a minister in European Parliament. That's Obama. He's like a great character in Brussels. He should be lobbying for, rights in Brussels, but he's not necessarily an American archetype. He's not, Trump is actually as American as you can possibly get. But the people, the circle jerk, Algonquin table, New York masturbators don't want to look in the mirror and understand that this is the country they live in.
When you mentioned that that's what spiritualists and those seance guys do, like those fortune tellers, these rip-off artists, they tell you what you want to hear, right? But they're nudging you for you to tell them what you want to hear. So that was what Cass Sunstein, of course, came up with for Obama, was this notion of nudging, that we need to nudge the people into believing what we believe, into, circle jerks around the Algonquin table. So now we skip to the point where the nudging wasn't enough for them. That's what it starts off, nudging. And then this is a good tweet about what's happened in the past week or two. Some slopes really are slippery. Twitter went from censoring Alex Jones to censoring the White House press secretary and the New York Post in little over a year. Of course, the New Yorker sorts, by the way, love the play Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton founded the New York Post 212 years ago. And now it's still not allowed, as of the time we're recording this, that they're still banned from Twitter for posting this information that was allegedly on some laptop that Hunter Biden was, during his period of time when he was on crack and heroin and whatever drugs he was addicted to. And addiction is a big problem. And, I'm not making fun of him for that, but he was at that time under the influence. So it makes sense that he would forget his laptop and bring it in and not know what he was doing.
Look, in the middle of a seance where everybody's around the table and their bias is being confirmed by spirit knockings at the window, no, don't turn the light on. Right? Don't turn the light on, because you're going to see the ghost in the works. You're going to see that the knocking under the table is because the guy sitting at the table has his foot on a pedal that goes across the room to a string and it pulls up that. It's all tricks. You can look it all up. The history of spiritualism in America, and Houdini busted them all up and he told you how all those tricks are done. But if you turn the lights on, boom, it's like, oh, I'm seeing the truth. So the New York Post is like, wait a minute, let's turn the lights on here so people can see something that they should see. And then Twitter said, wait a minute, no. Our business model is we're in the spiritualism business. We're in the seance business. We want to keep the lights off and confirm people's bias as much as we can, because they got to click them ads, click. That's how we make our revenue. If people started, showing them what was really going on, we might lose a penny on this quarter. So we can't possibly have that.
So the good thing about these people, though, is they are overcome with emotion and they are psychologically and traumatically damaged. They have PTSD was a huge thing in World War I. These people are genuinely suffering from PTSD, I do believe. And so I do have a little bit of sympathy, but they do project nonstop. They say, everybody else is a fascist. Let's cut off the internet. Let's keep them from being able to communicate. Everybody else is an authoritarian, not us. And yet they behave authoritarian. Putin is intervening in our elections, and then we need to intervene in our elections. So I
have another magic analogy.
Oh, good. Do your magic thing.
Right. So as I told you about this job I had in New York City when I was still a teenager. I worked for Maximiliano Londano, who was a Latin American magician at that time, somewhat famous. And he had a factory where he made tricks. And I worked in the factory for a while. And he was just an amazing character. But one of the things he used to do is he used to go onto a bus and hypnotize the entire bus. And people would fall out, being hypnotized, and they would get huge press. So the way it works basically is you've got 5 or 6 people on the bus that are working with you, the psychic or the magician. And you get on this bus and you stand up and you're going to say, I'm going to put this bus, hypnotize this bus. And you make your incantations, etc. Those 5 or 6 Confederates, as they're called, boom, they fall out. But what happens is the entire bus follows suit because people's natural tendency is to go with the crowd.
Hysteria.
The hysteria of it is whipped up. So this is, again, what happens in these performances with Rachel Maddow and these others on MSNBC. They're whipping up hysteria. And then they've got these Confederates like a Jeffrey Toobin who's home whacking it off, trying to squeeze one out while he's fantasizing about a civil war in America. But it brings in, millions of other people who are like caught up in the hysteria. And the next thing you know, they're like 2 minutes of hate. Now, I grew up when doing subliminal advertising on television was considered illegal. And, you couldn't do it. Think about it going back to the 60s, during the time of that famous political ad of pulling the petals off a daisy and equating that with an atomic bomb falling. That was considered radical and too in the face of people watching television. Contrast that with having an actual charlatan conduct a live seance on cable television to whip up enough hysteria to get people to go out into the street and burn down a church. I mean, that is amazing transformation of the American media from being somewhat informative during the Walter Cronkite days to being outright abject propaganda coming from
trying to get you to faint and pass out on the bus that is the American empire falling off the cliff, right? They want you to go over the cliff with them, but you don't need to. You could just be orange pilled. And again, I'm telling you, they're projecting that
they'll go over the cliff all right. And by the way, only 5 or 6 people will have parachutes. And guess what? You're not one of them.
Yeah. And let's look at some of the stuff that's actually happening. Remember, they keep on shouting that you, the people, are fascist, that you, the people, are deplorable. So let's look at some of the deplorable things they are actually, and these people are close to power. Here's the paper of record, the New York Times. In their magazine, they published this woman. And this is what she argues. Is the American First Amendment the best way to protect free speech? For New York Times Magazine, I argue that the answer is maybe not. At least we should consider how democracies in Europe and Canada, etc., do it by balancing free speech with other pro-democratic values. What they mean by other pro-democratic values is what the seance lady, Rachel Maddow, is telling you. If you agree with her and if you will retweet her and amplify her message, then yeah, you get free speech. If you're against anything they say, that they don't want to hear any other ideas. Like why is it that they can't hear any other ideas? Why are they so fragile? Why are they so afraid of hearing other opinions, even if they're stupid, bad opinions? Just tell somebody that's a stupid, bad opinion. Like, what does it threaten you if your belief system, if the foundations of your institutions and the fabric of your economy and society are okay or sound? Like, what does it have to do with you?
Here's my message to the New York Times. If you're afraid of free speech, write better. In other words, if your message isn't getting through, it's because you're a crap writer. Do you think Ernest Hemingway had a problem getting what he had to write through the clutter into the consciousness of folks? And do you think great artists have trouble getting into the consciousness, the unconscious, the subconscious minds of people to get their message through? No, they don't. And if you are frustrated that your message is not getting through, it's not because you need to change this free speech laws. It's not because people are stupid. It's because you're a shit writer and you don't know how to write anymore. And your syntax is fucked up. Your word choice is bad and your prose sucks. You want to read a good writer? Read Matt Taibbi. Does he have any problem getting through to his audience? No. Does he make good points? Yes, he does. How about Glenn Greenwald? He's a journalist. He writes. Does he have a problem getting his message through? No, he doesn't. Because he knows how to write. Okay, here's the paper of record, and they're so bad at writing basic sentences that they want to change free speech laws to make their crap writing less fucked up. I mean, that is so it's so sad. But the New York Times is right there with the New Yorker and Vanity Fair, and they're all on their Zoom calls jerking off with each other, and they just don't want to work. How about go back to Harvard, go back to Yale, go back to Princeton, and take Writing 101 and learn how to write a fucking sentence, you moron.
Well, also, like if you think of Shakespeare or you think of all the French Enlightenment thinkers, think of Denis Diderot, who wrote the Encyclopedia, or think of Descartes, and he was facing Inquisition, or the Florentine artist. This was a time of Inquisition and Black Plague. Like they were fearless in confronting the truth about the nature of man and confronting power. They confronted power when there was actually a risk that you could be tortured or drawn in.
Right, let's talk
quartered.
about a contemporary artist. Okay, we were talking about French art and the 19th century. Let's talk about Monet, his gardens. Let's talk about Banksy, who did a piece where it's a Monet, but with the trash and trolley cars in the water. Just sold, I think, for $100 million or some astronomical number. Because as an artist, Banksy took the message and communicated it in an image, and it resonated globally because he knows how to communicate with people because he's a great artist. Now, contrast that to the New York Times. They write a piece, an opinion piece, and nobody reads it because it's very poorly written. So the New York Times decided, you know what, maybe the law for free speech needs to change so that our special needs writers here at the New York Times, who never went to school but got in because their dad owns the company, can't write a fucking sentence. Okay, that's horrendous.
Okay, and then before we throw to our film with Abe Cambridge, I want to say that this guy Zaid Jalani, who is an amazing writer, follow him on Twitter, but about this piece calling for the suspension of the First Amendment, he said, America survived an awfully long time without canceling the First Amendment, but one election, Democrats don't win, and ... He also then followed it up. Americans today are far more tolerant and better informed than ever before. We don't live in the age of disinformation. This is a moral panic being used to justify authoritarian means. And exactly, going back to the days of Nathaniel Hawthorne. So back, at the origin of the transcendentalism, as we discussed with Michael Krieger, is like, these are the days of the Scarlet Letter. And before that, we had the Salem witch trials and stuff like that. We do have a puritanical streak, and that's in our nature, in the culture of America. And this is the moral panic that you're seeing. And it's all caused by, fundamentally, Hillary Clinton. I understand her pain, and I could see how it was a traumatic and humiliating moment, just like the traumatic and humiliating moment for the Germans post-World War I and the Versailles Treaty led to horror. So does this individual, Hillary Clinton, and her personal trauma is playing out in maybe not as gory and bloody, but it is like it's equally destructive in terms of what it's doing to the fabric and culture, moral fabric of the society. Is her personal humiliation. She should, MSNBC should, instead of trying to suspend the First Amendment and suspend and deplatform most ordinary deplorable Americans, what they should do is just encourage Hillary to go get psychological help or, drink a margarita.
I agree. It's all about Hillary not exiting stage gracefully, right? Al Gore lost, they fought it in Florida. He lost, and then he did something else with his life. He didn't spend the next 4 years.
Stolen from him.
Yeah, it was stolen from him. He didn't spend the next 4 years crying and trying to destroy the country.
Yeah.
Right. Here's Hillary Clinton. She loses an election. They put together a 4-year case that was foreign meddling, that proved to be a complete hoax, and then they tried a impeachment, which failed. And she's still the only interference in this election, you can say categorically without equivocation, comes from the Democrats in America working with big media in America. They are acting in a way to interfere with this election. And that is now, I think, without any question, the situation. And that, my friends, is another whole level of problem.
The seance.
Right.
Seance.
Foreign, everyone around the world is trying to, compete with other countries. That's been going on for a long time. Okay?
Centuries, thousands of years.
That's not to be unexpected. But when you're in officials at the various, CIA, FBI, go right down the list, are actively working to subvert your government, that's a completely different problem. And that's where we are now.
The seance. But, you can exit that system easily Unfortunately, because the smartest, most sophisticated people are in Orange Pill podcast group that's been confirmed by one of the greatest hedge fund managers in history, Paul Tudor Jones. And we're going to cut to a clip from Abe Cambridge about outer space.
There is no spoon. Today I'm not going to be talking about anything to do with energy, but I'm going to be talking about space travel and what it means for humanity. Now, I'm speaking as somebody that has already bought a ticket into space with Virgin Galactic, and I'm also speaking from the point of view as a climate change scientist, i.e. I'm very aware of the limits that our planet has, and some may say that it seems reckless to jump on a spacecraft and go into space whilst our planet is in such dire straits. But actually, it's quite the opposite. All of the technologies that are being developed for space travel are actually the saviors of mankind. If you just look at some of the technologies that have come about from space travel, you can look at hydroponics, i.e. the ability to grow crops in a controlled environment using far less resources, with less energy, with higher quality crops without needing to use pesticides and herbicides. That stuff's being developed on the International Space Station and should be being deployed in cities all around the world so we can have urban farming. Water recycling and air recycling. The fact that we are creating pollution into our oceans and into our rivers and into our air, this is totally unnecessary. They do not have polluted air or water in the International Space Station. They use technology to clean and filter this. Buckminster Fuller once said, there is no such thing as pollution, there is only unutilized resources. And then, of course, solar energy. Solar panels originally were used almost solely to be used on spacecraft, and then as the costs of those solar panels came down, they found terrestrial applications. As R. Buckminster Fuller once said, the Earth is like a spaceship, but it didn't come with an operating manual. And the fate of this spaceship that we live on, Spaceship Earth, hurtling through space on this giant ball of rock, is a common one. Whatever we do has an impact on not just the planet, but ourselves. And the only way we can survive and become a multiplanetary species is by utilizing and developing space-age technologies and deploying them on Earth so we can live harmoniously as one civilization and thrive.
Right. You know what I really liked about what he is saying that ties in with all the stuff that we've talked about, and including with Michael Krieger, is that he said, Buckminster Fuller said, there's no such thing as pollution. There's only unutilized resources. And that makes me think of what these charlatans on the MSNBC and CNN and Fox News and all the cable news channels are telling you. Like, they're looking at humans, at many of the voters, as deplorables and pollution. But what is the fact is that these are just underutilized resources. Just because our economy at the moment, the neoliberal, neoconservative economy is structured, and the financialized US dollar-based federal money printer go brrr system doesn't need most people. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't need everybody, that everybody should be used and utilized and participate in the economy. And it's not, if you're at the top, if you're making $20-30 million a year sitting in Manhattan spouting off your opinion on MSNBC, maybe you're the problem, not the person out in Idaho or Missouri or, North Carolina. It's maybe you're the problem. Maybe that's what you should do. And maybe that will, provide a more, wholesome sort of positive future.
Right. Well, space exploration has been the cornerstone for all technological innovation in America, going back to the 1960s. And as pointed out, a lot of the technologies in the space program eventually worked their way into our common day life. And unfortunately, what we have is, in this case, I'll say, take kind of the other point of view a little bit here, because a lot of information turns into information pollution, right?
Sure.
So a lot of that information comes out as pollution. It's not signal, it's just noise. And that's another pollution problem that we have. Our discourse in the news business has become total mired in pollution. But in terms of space and its ability to trigger technological innovation and economic growth, remember that the man landing on a moon, the Apollo 11, 1969, was financed by the government. It was not a private enterprise that put man on the moon. It was a government enterprise. So the reason I mention this is because there's private enterprise and competition is fantastic. And it does lead to a kind of evolutionary arc and a trajectory that is satisfying for everybody across the globe. But there is room to have governance in communities at some level. And in the case of the reaction to the Sputnik moment during the Cold War, the U.S. mobilized and put a man on the moon. The U.S. mobilized and won World War II. There is a role going, again, I often refer back to the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks kind of developed this idea of the polis, or political entity, the social contract as we know it, who went all the way through the centuries and developed these ideas. And the founding fathers of America came up with a way to distribute power in governing, and a lot of checks and balances. And they came up with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so and Bitcoin is a consensus algorithm. It's often referred to as a consensus algorithm. That's the governance of Bitcoin, is the consensus algorithm. So it's Constitution, Bill of Rights, Bitcoin, right? It's the latest evolution and iteration of governance. The protocol is governed mathematically. It's not chaos. It's not anarcho-capitalism. It's an extraordinarily disciplined and specific algorithm that governs the consensus of the Bitcoin protocol.
But I also want to jump in there and say, that those limitations and constrictions on do provide creativity, an opportunity for creativity, whether it's on, as Abe mentioned, the space station, because they can't, they can't have pollution. They need to recycle all their air and their water. So it forces them to not be lazy. We have this massive earth that we think we can just we don't need to think about this. We're just going to spew all this garbage, right? And not use it and leave it for future generations or the Fed to fix. The fact is, if we had a harder money, if we were by the restrictions of the consensus or the protocol forced to account for all costs at the moment, perhaps we would have more creativity, more inclusion. Perhaps we wouldn't need to cast aside half the population, even 75% of the population, as deplorables.
Well, this is the problem with Adam Smith in a lot of ways. During his time in the 18th century and the Enlightenment, was that their notion of running out of natural resources seemed abstract. Mm-hmm. That because of natural resources, they nod to the fact that capitalism mirrors natural order in a lot of different ways, but that the idea of polluting the earth so severely that you would run out of natural resources, they don't really talk about it in that textbook, in that book, Wealth of Nations. And that book is still used, today as the reference book, even though it is outdated. In the last 50, 60 years, the notions of externalities, the true costs of production for companies, particularly in the energy industry, has become more understood. And that unless, as Buckminster Fuller proved, unless there's a circular economy and a circular element to your enterprise, you do externalize your pollution, which is an externalization of costs, which then eventually have to be paid for by the citizens, filtered through a government. And then to get that passed, the government becomes incredibly corrupt, which is what we have today. A rubber stamp government that takes every corporate externality and says, we're just going to dump it we're going to socialize those risks by having an ecology that collapses. Or in the case of Wall Street, we're going to socialize the risks of Wall Street by putting it into the public domain in the form of bailouts, which is going to destroy our currency, the US dollar.
Well, we shouldn't have unutilized resources. And in America at the moment, there are too many of them. In many countries, it's often the resource curse, they call it, right? You have too much free money. You have, loads of oil like Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or Russia or Norway. They have oil and they could just print it and they don't need to have the consent of the people. And therefore, the people become underutilized. So they don't need to work for it. It happened with the Spanish Empire. That's how the Spanish Empire collapsed. They conquered all of America's, and all they cared about was the gold. And they didn't care about the Caribbean because there was no gold there. So that was left to the Dutch and the British. And what did? They built empires off of what they were able to build from there. Conquered people, of course, but that's for another episode. So, what we have is like underutilization in much of the economy because of a fiat system. And we don't have that in the Bitcoin space because it is a consensus algorithm. It is a protocol, a hard money protocol. And, you either contribute or you get kicked out, right? It's like an iambic pentameter. So, Shakespeare writes in that. And yet, like the guy, that's part of the reason why he invented so many words of the English language. It had to fit into iambic pentameter. So he had to invent words in order to make the poem or the play work.
So true, and I'm going to be really fascinated to see what happens when Bitcoin Standard gets into that whole next level of adoption. When people's entire kind of understanding of money, it changes in a quantum leap. That because, we have this tension between wants and needs. And most people are driven by their wants. And in America, when you can just print money, wants dominate. So it's like, America, we want to invade this country. You don't need to, but we want to. So we're going to print a lot of money. We want to, we want to do a lot of stuff. We don't need to do it, but we want it. So we're going to print lots of money. So now with Bitcoin, you have to be now, forget what you want. It's only what you need. And when people's needs are completely met, as it can under Bitcoin, the society is completely different in a lot of different ways, which we can talk about another time. But it's a very, very different post-Bitcoin world.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Sats, Margs, and Orange Pill. And we had a good time. We enjoyed it. We enjoyed it. We hit 4,000 in the Telegram group.
That's awesome. That's just growing by leaps and bounds. I think the downloads of this podcast we're in the top 1% now.
Oh, we are in the top 1% on the podcast and even higher in the YouTube, the video views of it. And remember, Paul Tudor Jones says he likes Bitcoin even more now than he did in March and April when he was
down
buying.
the rabbit hole.
Yeah, he was buying down below 6,000, but he likes it even more at 13,000. He says the rally is still in the first inning. So that's good. We can, it's a fight between dark and light and bad and good and evil and goodness. And
Fiat versus Bitcoin.
Yeah, fiat versus Bitcoin. And I think we're going to win because we have the positive message. The other side has a negative message whereby they have to get rid of the First Amendment. We need to deplatform everybody. Everybody's welcome to try to fuck up Bitcoin even. Like they always lose.
Yeah,
and
do
it makes it stronger.
Come at us, buddy. Take your best shot. Oh, yeah, bye. Orange pill. Do we play the music on the outro as well?
Have you ever watched an episode?
Yeah, I just don't remember.
Of course we play it.
Orange pill, orange pill. It's not red, it's blue, just for you. Check it out. Take all you want. I've got some extras right here. Hey, Guillermo. Si, senor. Here, Guillermo, it's time for your orange pill. Si, senor. I love the orange pill. Stacy, you look beautiful today. As usual, I play you a nice song on my guitar. Stacy is a wonderful person.
Es muy bonita.
Yeah, muy bonita. That's what I say.